in private schools, and my son went and saw it, and he said, "You know, Dad, it's not that good." And I said, "It's your junior and senior year. It's the best movie ever made." So, you ever see The Truman Show? Has anybody seen that with Jim Carrey? Yeah. For those that haven't seen it, very briefly, Jim Carrey plays a guy named Truman whose whole life from birth is a reality TV show. And so he lives in this town that he thinks, but he doesn't know it. So he lives in this town he thinks is real life. And it's actually a TV set. He's got all these friends and a wife, and they're all actors just playing people. And it's a profitable show. It's got a lot of sponsors, so they got to keep it on the air. But the only way they can keep it on the air is by keeping Truman from finding out that he's in a fake world. And so the way they do this is they teach him to be afraid from the day he's a baby till he grows up. So they say, like, don't go over that bridge, Truman, because it's really dangerous. Don't go down that road, you know, don't go into the water. Don't even go on vacation because terrible things happen to you. I feel that this has become a perfect metaphor for the left in America. They are taught at your age to be afraid of any idea they disagree with. You know, don't listen to that idea, Truman. It's fascist. Don't listen to that idea. It's white supremacist. Don't listen to that idea. It's, you know, war on women or whatever it is. It's like training people to ignorance. It's training people to ignorance. It's keeping you, the only way you can become wise over time is to listen to people who you disagree with. Now, we on the right have an advantage, which is that the left owns the means of communication. So we're constantly listening to what they have to say. And what's the worst thing that happens to you? Maybe they convince you on a point, or maybe you sharpen your argument against them and you become better, your beliefs become more sound. So what I really want to talk about, I'm going to talk about Hollywood because I have a lot of experience and it is pretty funny out there. I'm going to talk about it, but I want to just put it in a larger context, talking about what the left calls the narrative. And the narrative is a real thing. I mean, the narrative is kind of the atmosphere we breathe. Sometimes they call it the Overton window. They call it the Overton window is the things you're allowed to think and discuss, what is reasonable to believe. And it affects you without your knowing it. I mean, we all are part of it. The story I always like to tell about the narrative and how powerful it is about George Washington, who, if you ever read, he was a president. If you ever read about him, he was a man of extraordinary virtue. I mean, he was an unbelievable human being who gave up a kingdom. He gave away a kingdom because he believed in liberty. He ended the Revolutionary War with an army at his back. They would have followed him into hell. They had followed him into hell. They were ready to promote him to be the king. The people wanted him to be king, and instead he marched to the Capitol, handed his sword to the civil authorities, to the Congress, as a symbol that this was going to be a free country. When King George III heard that he was just going to go home, he said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And he was. He was an amazingly virtuous guy who believed in liberty. Your liberty comes from his virtue. George Washington could not understand, I swear this is true, he could not fathom why his slaves didn't work as hard on the land as he did. He just couldn't figure it out. He would complain about it all the time. He'd say, I work hard. How are you going to get anything out of the land if you don't work hard? Why don't they work hard? He had a slave named Una Judge, who was his wife Martha's home slave, basically. And they treated her really well, really respectfully, and they kind of made her part of the family. She escaped. He couldn't figure out why. George Washington, the father of liberty, the guy who basically invented modern liberty, could not figure out why she would escape. He thought she must have been seduced. You know, some guy must have seduced her. That's the narrative. That's what the narrative does to the best of men, to the best of people. I mean, which Washington was. But just to add, this is off this topic, but George Washington did figure it out by the end of his life, and he's the only slave-holding founder who let his slaves go. He freed them. But that's the grip that narrative has, and I think it hasn't changed at all. I mean, it hasn't changed at all. For me, I think about abortion. I think about the fact that 3,000 babies are aborted every day. And we're sitting here, we're talking. Even those of us who feel that this is wrong don't really feel what is happening because of the narrative, because the narrative has deadened our feelings about it. And I know many people feel passionately on, you know, pro-abortion. I know many of them. I know many women who've had abortions. But within my lifetime, which it's like 20 minutes probably, within my lifetime, they'll invent wombs outside the womb, you know, non-natural wombs where you'll be able to see babies growing. At that point, the same people who tear down statues of Robert E. Lee because he couldn't step outside the narrative are going to be tearing down statues of us because they're going to call us savages. They're not going to care that we invented the iPhone. They're going to say, look, this is what you did. And that's the narrative, and it affects all of us. So my concern is the fact that the left owns the narrative. I'm a freedom guy. I just want people to be free. I want people to do whatever they want. I know if I'm free, you got to be free, right? But the left owns the narrative. Here's my quick resume. I was a newspaper man. I was a radio newsman. I became a novelist, a best-selling novelist, and I became a Hollywood screenwriter. I've worked in the narrative business all my life. I know how narrative is made. And I know what it does to people and how it controls people, and I'm genuinely concerned about the fact that the left owns the narrative and we on the right don't care. We do not care. I used to make speeches begging, going to think tanks. I used to beg them, you know, instead of putting $1 million into a congressional race, put it into a TV show, put it into a movie, buy a women's magazine. Every women's magazine is left-wing, every comedian on TV. And the news especially. Before I get to Hollywood, let me just talk a little bit about the news, because 7%, you know, people talk about Fox News all the time. Fox News has 1/10 the viewership of the networks. 7% of journalists identify as Republicans. 28% identify as Democrats. The rest are lying and are Democrats. I have been in many, many newsrooms. They're all Democrats. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the availability heuristic. This is important for establishing narrative. The availability heuristic is this. Sometimes they just call it availability bias. Your picture of life, your picture of what's happening in life, naturally comes from those ideas that are most available to you, right? The ones that are easy to imagine and the ones you're confronted with most of the time. This really affects us. It really affects us big time. So for instance, the other day, Tuesday, a plane blew out an engine and a woman was killed. Brave woman pilot landed the plane. Whenever there's a plane crash, you hear about it all day long, and people are afraid to fly. I know plenty of people who are afraid to get on a plane, and everybody's a little nervous when they get on a plane. I've been in hurricanes on a plane, and people start screaming and panicking. That was the first person to die on an airplane since 2009 in America, in an American airplane, okay? You are safe on an airplane. You're not safe in a car. 40,000 people a year die in cars. What would happen if every time somebody died in a car, they reported it the way they report an airplane crash, right? You'd never get in a car because it would be happening every minute. Same thing with nuclear power. They're shutting down nuclear power plants in Europe. They're shutting them down, the cleanest, most efficient form of energy we have. Do you know that outside of Chernobyl in Russia, where they couldn't do anything right, nobody's ever died in a nuclear accident? In Japan, they had a hurricane, an earthquake, and a tsunami. Broke their nuclear power plant. Still nobody died. Nobody died from the nuclear radiation. It's pretty safe stuff. But anytime it happens, anytime there's a leak, it's horrific, right? So it's horrific. So that's the way the availability heuristic works. Then you have a news industry dominated by Democrats. Now, when people are all together and they all believe the same stuff, like maybe the people in this room, I don't know, maybe there are people who disagree with me here, and I hope, if there are, I hope you'll stay and ask questions afterwards, because I'd like to talk to you. When people agree with each other, they become a little bit more radicalized when there's nobody to say, you know, that idea is going a little too far. You know, you might want to dial that back a little. When there's nobody to say, you know, that's really not true, here are some facts. You start to kind of reel off a little bit, you know. People who believe that America is racist vote for Democrats. I think 78% of Democrats believe America is racist. So you've got Democrats running the news industry, and you've got your mind shaped by the ideas that are available to you. So let's talk about Starbucks, okay? A couple days ago, two guys walk into Starbucks, and the lady there, who's the manager, who is a social justice warrior with buttons on her head, you know. I don't know why they always have to have more than one button, more than one bumper sticker. You know, have you ever noticed? Like, no, you know, you get one bumper sticker. You know, you don't need 15 bumper stickers. She asked the two to leave because they're not buying anything and they want to use the bathroom. They refuse to leave. She calls the police. The police come in. The police ask them to leave, and they refuse to leave again, okay? And they're black. And the police arrest them. They don't charge them with anything, but they just take them out in cuffs. It gets on the video. The video goes viral. Protests begin. People start threatening a boycott. 8,000 Starbucks have now shut down so that people can be trained in what? In what? You know, not throwing guys out when they use the bathroom without buying. You know, I'm not sure. Is that a racial incident? Is it a news story? I would say that is not a news story. There are 300 million people in this country. When two guys refuse to leave a Starbucks and get thrown out, I'm sorry, I am not sending the press. That is not a story. But it is very hard to, when you talk to a leftist about racism and you tell them, listen, I'm going to tell you something. This is stone true. I don't care what color you are. I do not care. I don't care who you sleep with. I really don't. I am going to tell you, your generation is going to colonize Mars. The last thing that you have to worry about is racism. Like, I'm the oldest guy in this room. That's living in the past. That is living in the past. If you are worried about, I lived overseas a long time, 7 years. This is the least racist country. You want to prove it? Go look at a street scene of New York City, then look at a street scene of Riyadh, then look at a street scene of Shanghai or anywhere, you know, Beijing, anywhere you like. This is the only place. This is the only place where we look like the mutts we are, okay, where we all look different. So it's not a racist country. I don't believe it is. I mean, I don't believe it is. But how can you help but think it is when they cover stories like that? And they cover it in that way. And they basically let people play the press because the people playing the press are the same people reporting the stories. And it gets violent. When Michael Brown was shot and they pushed that narrative that turned out to be untrue, that he had his hands up and was saying, don't shoot, there were riots. Nobody has ever held the press to account for that. Eric Holder's Justice Department found that that story wasn't true. Eric Holder and Barack Obama's Justice Department found that that story was never true, but nobody ever was held to account. So now let's get to Hollywood and why they think you're stupid. I don't even know if they think you're stupid. I once said to an agent in New York, a book agent in New York, you know, she was arranging the publication of my book, and I said, you know, I think I can get on. Brilliant woman, by the way, one of the best agents I ever worked with, as smart as a whip. I mean, she just knew everything there was. Every time I talked to her, I learned something about my own business. And I said to her one day, you know, I think I can get on Hannity. And she said, who's Hannity? I don't think Hollywood actually knows you're here. You know? So let's talk about what Hollywood does with the narrative that they get from their fellow Democrats. And obviously, you know, Hollywood is a big Democrat city. You watch the Oscars, you heard them. I could tell you, I could stand here for the rest of this time I'm here and just tell you stories about it. Well, I'll tell you a couple anyway. You know, like when you walk in to sell a story in Hollywood, which I've done a lot, and it's very hard. You know, the odds are always against you. You walk in and you make conversation, and the conversation frequently starts with, isn't George W. Bush an idiot? Isn't Donald Trump the worst person who ever lived, right? And you're there to sell something, and there's 15 other guys out there who are younger, you know, smarter, better looking than you, who want to sell their thing. And if you're a big mouth like me, you have to say, you know, I'm on the other side of this question. And it's like, don't let the door hit you on the way out, like they throw you out. So that's how Democrats, liberals in Hollywood are so bold that I had a friend call up a showrunner. The showrunner is a guy who runs a TV show, right? The most important person on the TV set. She called up a showrunner with an idea. She said, I want to pitch you an idea. She said, the showrunner said, great, I'm on my way to a Hillary fundraiser. I'll pick you up on the way and you can pitch it to me. So that's how bold they are. We, conservatives, I swear this is true, we had an organization that was secret. It was called Friends of Abe. The first rule, it was like Fight Club, the first rule of Friends of Abe was we couldn't talk about Friends of Abe. It was conservatives in Hollywood. You know why we called it Friends of Abe? Because in the old days when it would cost you your job to be gay, they used to call gay people friends of Dorothy, like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. So they would say, Rock Hudson, is he a friend of Dorothy, you know? So we were friends of Abe Lincoln because if you admitted you were a conservative. So what did a conservative meeting look like in Hollywood? A conservative meeting looked like in Hollywood. We'd all sit around a lunch table and somebody would make a speech, you know, usually Gary Sinise. And by the way, the organization doesn't exist anymore. If it did, I would have to kill you after telling you this. somebody would make a speech, like Gary Sinise or, there were like 5 big actors there. And then they'd go around the table and each person would stand up, and it was like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, And people stand up and say, my name is Andrew, I'm a conservative, hi Andrew, and you tell stories about what it was like to be a conservative in Hollywood. The result of this, okay, now, it's not that there are no conservative movies made. That is not true. I mean, if you watch Christopher Nolan movies, he's an obvious conservative. The Dark Knight stories are obviously conservative stories. Almost all conservative stories are fantasies, and the left, what the left does is they solidify the narrative made in the news in historical films. They do this over and over again. Here's a story from my childhood. When I was 10, the President of the United States was murdered, right? John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was a staunch anti-communist Cold War warrior, right? Democrat, but he said we would bear any burden to defend freedom. He was going to attack the Soviet Union. He was killed by a communist, Lee Harvey Oswald. That's who killed him. It has now been established really beyond a shadow of a doubt. The man who killed him was a guy he was nuts, but he had tried to defect to the Soviet Union. He was so crazy, even they didn't want him, They thought, like, we're crazy, we're communists, but we're not that crazy. They sent him back. He was afraid Kennedy was going to overturn the Castro regime in Cuba, so he shot John F. Kennedy. The day Oswald was arrested, the New York Times, which at the time was a newspaper, the New York Times ran a front page story talking about Lee Harvey Oswald, right? And the fact that and it ran a front page story by a famous writer, famous at the time, named James Reston. On the front page, an op-ed that said, hate killed John F. Kennedy. Hate killed John F. Kennedy. What did that mean? It meant the Southern racists who did hate John F. Kennedy because of his civil rights initiatives, all Democrats, by the way, their hate had killed John F. Kennedy. Now, they were hateful, they were racists, and they were Democrats, but they didn't kill John F. Kennedy, okay? They just didn't do it. It's like he was killed by, and because the left was sympathetic to the Soviets, they didn't want to report the story. And this spun out into the famous John F. Kennedy conspiracy, right? Who killed Kennedy? This went on for all of my adult life. Who killed Kennedy? It was some conspiracy. And finally, in the 90s, Oliver Stone, a terrific director, made a movie called JFK. Anybody seen JFK? Okay. A couple people. Kevin Costner plays a crusading DA, it's a true story, who puts on trial a massive conspiracy of conservatives who killed John F. Kennedy because he was trying to pull out of Vietnam. And so the conservatives killed him. And Kevin Costner is the hero putting forward this case. Now, in real life, the jury, I think, took under an hour to dump this case. It was such a crazy, stupid case, right? But in the movie, Costner's the hero. That's the story. Right? This happens again and again and again. Argo, the Ben Affleck picture that just won the Oscar, like 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago, was the story of the Iranian hostage crisis. Jimmy Carter, who mishandled that crisis from beginning to end such that people, soldiers were dying in rescue missions, people were quitting. It was his fault that it happened to begin with. I mean, obviously it was the hostage taker's fault, but it was his fault that the place erupted. He's edited out of the story except in this noble role. So Jimmy Carter is the noble hero, the noble president in Argo. They continually solidify this narrative. One of the reasons my Hollywood career kind of got nailed was during the war on terror. One film after another was made saying that our soldiers were rapists, our soldiers were killers. That was the Valley of Elah. I remember he comes home and he's so upset by having been in Iraq that he starts killing people. They were fools, Lions for Lambs with Tom Cruise. That was where the Republicans were wanted a war to manipulate the press, and so they sent these poor, foolish, patriotic clowns off to war, and they got killed. One movie after another. And I started to protest. I started to write pieces about it because I didn't care whether they were for or against the war, but I thought it was wrong to make anti-war propaganda while the soldiers were in the field. That had never happened before. So I started writing about it, and of course, it was kind of hard to get a job after that, but it was worthwhile. So they're making one picture like this after another. Every one of them bombed. Every one of them bombed. And so Variety, which is our trade paper, the show business trade paper, started to write pieces saying, you know, people just don't want to see movies about the war on terror. I mean, that's how wrapped up in their narrative they are. People don't want to see movies about the war on terror. And then Clint Eastwood made American Sniper, and it became one of the biggest grossing R-rated films in history. And they said, gee, that's strange. You know, why did people go to this picture? Well, it's because American soldiers weren't portrayed as rapists and killers and madmen, when in fact our enemy were the bad guys. You can be against the war, but we weren't the bad guys, right? We might not, maybe we shouldn't have been there, but we weren't the bad guys. And that's all American Sniper showed, and people showed up for it in droves. So who cares? Okay. The other day, Donald Trump pardoned a guy named Scooter Libby. And I'm not going to go into the story because it's so long and boring. But just in case you don't know, before there was Donald Trump, there was George W. Before Donald Trump was the worst person on earth, Mitt Romney was the worst person on earth. And before Mitt Romney was the worst person on earth, George W. Bush was the worst person on earth. I mean, it was real. It was not, I'm not kidding around. I mean, this guy, you know, George W. Bush, maybe not the brightest light in the chandelier, but not a bad man. I mean, a good man trying to do his best. And they just hated him, and they went after him with everything they got. A guy named Joseph Wilson wrote an editorial after we went into Iraq claiming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which everybody said. All our intelligence said that. All the Democrats said it. John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, they all called for Saddam Hussein to be overthrown. So we went in, overthrew Saddam Hussein, couldn't find the weapons of mass destruction, and suddenly everybody was going at Bush. He lied to us. He lied. He didn't lie. He had the same intelligence as everybody else. So Joseph Wilson wrote this piece saying Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons. It was debunked. While they were debunking it, a journalist named Novak exposed the fact that Wilson's wife was a CIA agent. He used to introduce her as my CIA agent wife, okay, so it wasn't a big secret, but that became the scandal. Same way as Russia collusion became the scandal after Trump was elected instead of the emails. Suddenly that became the scandal. Valerie Plame was exposed. Oh my God, a special counsel, just like now, special counsel was appointed. Big investigation. They found out it had nothing to do with Bush, nothing to do with Cheney. It was all ridiculous. But one guy, this guy Scooter Libby, got caught telling two different stories to the FBI and was convicted. And that's the guy he pardoned. They made a movie about this called Fair Game, right? I'm sure you've all seen Fair Game. I think it may be the lowest rated movie ever made, except for mine, in which Valerie Plame is suddenly a CIA hero, and Dick Cheney and George W. Bush are conspiring against her. And they said to Joseph Wilson, let me see, I wrote down the quote, let me see if I can find it. They said to Joseph Wilson, nobody's going to go see this movie. You know, nobody's going to talk about it. And Joseph Wilson said, for people who have short memories or don't read, this is the only way they will remember the period. Life is short, art is long. Art lasts forever. Movies will be out there forever. You, one night at 3 o'clock in the morning, will be channel surfing, and you will see JFK on TV. And if you don't know any better, that's what you think the story is going to be. They own the narrative. They own the narrative. We are all living in Truman's world, okay? And the last way I want to talk about, the last part about the narrative I want to talk about is simply language. And this is something I have studied my whole life, the way people use language and the way they abuse language. And universities, I feel, are the core of this problem and the generators of this problem. The left has become unbelievable at using language to demonize normal human life, okay? We use phrases, and we do it all the time. We pick up their phrases and we argue about them. Like the objectification of women. What does the objectification of women mean? It means men like to look at women. Men like to look at pretty women. Everybody who is in this room today because men like to look at pretty women. That's how you got here. If anybody is shocked, I'm sorry. Don't report me. Now, are some men louts? Yes. Do some men misuse their, power and their sexuality? Of course, this is the world, right? People are bad. People are not nice. But to say that the fact that men admire beauty in women is something inherently toxic, inherently wrong, is essentially to condemn the human condition. You know, it's essentially to condemn something that actually is beautiful, something that actually is one of the main sources of comfort and joy for both men and women, and to make us feel like we have to second guess it all the time. You know, you could be talking about manners, you could be talking about abuse of power, you could be talking about respect, but instead to be talking about the objectification of women is simply to toxify normal human life. Another one, racial profiling. You're a cop? Really? I mean, you're a TSA agent and a young Muslim male comes up down your line? Now, here's the thing. You are going to pay more attention to that guy. You have to. Why? Not because he's guilty. The chances are huge that he's innocent. But the chances the guy who's going to blow up the plane looks like him. That's police work. That's how police work works, right? It's really uncomfortable. It's really horrible that he has to go through that. But the alternative is the guy ends up searching Barbara Bush just to pretend that he's not going to search Muhammad, right? That's just asking him to lie. That's just asking him to not live in the real world. That's just creating Truman's world so that we don't have to live with the uncomfortable fact that we are dealing with a portion of humanity that produces most of the terrorists. It's a real world. It's the real world. It's uncomfortable. And by the way, I really feel for people who get pulled over in neighborhoods where the police think, you know, the police have that spider sense, right? They think like, that guy doesn't belong here. I feel bad when people get pulled over, but I feel much worse when people get robbed and killed. And finally, my favorite one is cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is the best thing about America. Cultural appropriation is one of the best inventions ever, okay? America, when we talk about American exceptionalism, people think that means America's the best. It doesn't. It doesn't. It means America is different. Every other country was invented on a racial basis. Every single other one. France is France because the Franks lived there. Germany is Germany because the Germans tribes lived there. England is England because the Angles lived here. Only this country was invented on an idea, a creed. It's a creedal country. Come into our country legally, adopt our creed, bring the spaghetti. That's it. That's it. Anybody can be an American 5 minutes after you're here. I lived in England for 7 years. I could have lived there 107 years. I never would have been an Englishman. But you get off the boat here, you sign the card, you swear to the Constitution, you're an American, you know? You owe us your food. You owe us your funny hats. We get to dress up as you on Halloween, and you get to be free. It's a great deal of cultural appropriation. I mean, it's nuts. It is absolutely nuts. Does anybody want to live in a city like this one that doesn't have a Chinese restaurant? There was an entire article in the New York Times, a woman complaining about Asian salad. I thought, if Asian salad is what you have to complain about, you are living on the greatest country on earth. You know, this is great. You're complaining about Asian salad. All of these things derive, I'll wrap up because I really want to talk to you, but all of these things derive from a notion on the left that is actually their central notion, which is there is no moral reality. And so, if you win the narrative, you win the world. This is why they shout at you and, they say, the reason I left the country, I was at a dinner party with my wife in New York. This is in the late 80s, late 1980s. And I said, boys and girls, because we were all young parents, I said, boys and girls are really different. And the dinner party shut down and went silent. Because that was like a rude thing to say. That was the first wave, right? And I walked out of the restaurant, I turned to my wife and I said, we are leaving the country. I'm not going to live in a country where I can't speak the simplest truth, right? The simplest truth, that men and women are different. So the reason they have to shut you down is because they think if you win the narrative, you win reality. I mean, the reality doesn't even make sense because then they'll tell you that a man is a woman in a man's body. And you think if there's no difference between men and women, how do you know? How do you even know you're a woman in a man's body if men and women are entirely the same, you know? It would just be like having a man in a man's body. They have to shut you down because they think if they win the narrative, they win reality. Now, in order to believe this, that there is no moral there is no morality. You have to think like this. I mean, this is the thing they say, you have to respect all cultures. There's a billboard in Hollywood that says, respect all cultures. It's just like an ad for jeans or something like this. So really, respect all cultures, buy our jeans. And I think, really, do I have to respect all cultures? I mean, in the South, before the Civil War, they held slaves. That was their culture. I don't respect that culture. In Germany, they murdered human beings by the carload. I got to respect that culture? I got no respect for that culture. In Saudi Arabia, a woman can't go outdoors without asking her male relative for permission. Got no respect for that culture. In order to believe what they believe, there was a time, way back, right, before America, in the ancient world, when every single human being on earth thought slavery was normal and right, even the slaves. They may have thought it was bad for them, they may have thought they shouldn't be slaves, but there was nobody walking the planet Earth at that moment who thought that slavery was a bad thing, or that it should even be argued about. It just was. It just was. Were they right? There was nobody to say they were wrong. Were they right? I don't think they were. I think every single human being on earth could be a Nazi and they'd still be in the wrong. And I think the left thinks that too, they just won't admit it. So there is another narrative, that's our narrative, which is the narrative of the truth. You know, I'm not one of these guys who believe that facts are everything. I think the internal world is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The jaguar would not be swift unless we had the word swift in our mind. The jaguar doesn't know what it is, only we know, you know. The inner world matters. But you gotta align it with the real world, and that's what stories are for. And the fact that the right doesn't know how to tell stories, and the fact that it doesn't care, and the fact that it doesn't pay attention to the arts except to complain about them and censor them, is a problem for me, you know? So I'll just leave you with this. The truth will set you free, but you gotta know how to tell it. You gotta know how to tell the story. Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
All right, if you have your questions for Mr. Klavan, go ahead and line up on this side here, and we'll do them one by one until Mr. Klavan drops dead from exhaustion. So that's the plan. Ready to go? Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Klavan. My name is Yash. Thank you so much for coming here and talking to us. We really appreciate it. So my question is that in a lot of the Indian communities, specifically a lot of immigrant communities, have noticed a lot of people just buy into the narrative. And, you know, like when I go and I tell people, you know, oh, I'm Republican, they're like shocked. You know, even at the voting station, they ask, what party are you for? I say Republican. Just, you know, their whole face shifts. And so a lot of times when I've tried, you know, changing the narrative or telling the story, it takes a long time. They have to get to know me. They have to trust me. They have to see me as a good person or knowledgeable before they can even take my ideas at face value. So in your experience, is there a way to tell the story in a quicker manner, to get those things out quicker, to change the narrative around people like us, to make a change in our communities?
I tell you what I try. It doesn't work all the time, but I tell you what I try. One of the things that we tend to do is we tend to hit people with facts. Facts, facts, facts. You see Paul Ryan standing in front of the board with his pointer, you know, you just kind of doze off. But the real question is this: which is your best life, right? Which is the best life? Is your best life to be a victim, to go up to people and say, oh, you hurt me, and therefore you should give me a job, you should give me money? Or is your best life to walk in tall and say, I am the best there is. You don't like me because of the color of my skin? You're an idiot. You know, this is me. I'm going to beat you out at your game. When I listen to white people talk about the plight of black people, I think, you know what you should do for black people? Compete with them. Make them raise their game. Make them be excellent. That's the dignity of life. That's where all the dignity and beauty and fun of life come from. So what I would say is, facts are great, but people know these things inherently, and if you tell them the true story of human lives, of what a human life is, they recognize it. And you might try that instead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alexander. I was wondering, do you think that the strength of the leftist narrative is mostly a result of the sort of democratic intolerance of conservative ideas, or conservatives' failure to speak and express themselves?
I think it's conservatives' fault. I think it is conservatives' fault. When I get up and give speeches, and I used to go to think tanks and beg them, basically, we need awards because artists work for love. You know, we need review venues, we need studios, we need money, we need all these things. And they used to look at me, and I used to think they're looking at me just like my wife looks at me when I tell her that if something's on sale, it still costs money. You know, she looks at me and she's like, "You're a really cute guy, but I don't know what you're talking about, you know, and that's the way the right looks at it. We let it go. We let it go. We let the universities go. We let the news business go. We let the Hollywood go, and we should take it back.
Oh, Lord of the Multiverse, Klavan.
Thank you for my proper title. I appreciate it.
I was wondering, in a similar vein, if you could elaborate on the problem of legitimacy that right-wing institutions such as, say, Hillsdale College or Fox News face, in that even though they are doing the work that you want of giving a conservative message, of making a cultural, of trying to make a cultural impact in this left-wing narrative, in the midst of this left-wing narrative, but it seems as though they're fighting an uphill battle because the entrenched left-wing institutions try to delegitimize them, try to say, oh, that's just a right-wing outlet. You can't trust them. They're making up the facts, or they're completely unreliable. How would you say that conservatives could fight that best?
It's a brilliant tactic. I mean, I did a whole video once of just leftist slurs, where they would say things like, "Oh, that's Fox News," you know, that's Hillsdale College. Now, all they say, there's no argument, you know, that's old news, that's in the past. You know, they just these phrases that they come up with to demonize right-wing outlets. You know, I've got all kinds of problems with Donald Trump, but the one thing I really enjoy about him is that he goes after them for this stuff. He goes after them for this stuff. In some ways, the thing I like least about Donald Trump, the fact that he's a bore, the fact that he has poor manners, is sometimes the most effective thing, because one of the things the left has done is they have colonized manners so that it has become impolite to speak simple truths. So I think the answer here is you've got to fight back the same way. Like what Trump did to CNN was genius. It's a left-wing operation. CNN is a left-wing operation. And he just pointed it out. And I think that if we could do that with maybe a little less of the bullying, maybe a little less of the boorishness, I think that's the right thing to do. I think that the idea that we don't fight back enough on these matters is true, and we should fight back more. Yeah.
Thank you.
I really like that you talked about Argo. I'm from Iran and stuff like that. My dad says the second guy he hates after Khomeini is Jimmy Carter.
I'm not surprised. Ben Affleck would be surprised, but I'm not surprised.
I wouldn't be here. He would have stayed in Iran. But what I want to talk about is I don't really talk politics with my friends and stuff like that, and like really like far out there. I feel like I may be taking the easy way out. But what do you think? Should I press this stuff with my good friends and stuff like that, or just?
You know, the trick that I have learned, because I've still got a few leftist friends who haven't like kicked me out, is if you're going to talk politics, talk principle, don't talk people, because all people do bad things, right? And an argument that goes, well, Barack Obama did this, well, Trump does this, is really not going anywhere. But if you start talking about freedom and how you preserve it, and if you start talking about what happens in communist countries, and you start talking about what happens in socialist countries, just the ideas, why the ideas don't work, I think you can have a civil conversation with your friends and not lose them. When you hammer the people, you just get into these endless arguments that really don't talk about what you're for. They just talk about what you're against. And we're all against people doing bad things. Yeah.
Hi, Drew. Thank you for coming. I did watch your show today. Loved it. My name is Mark, and my question was, how did the left originally gain such a strong foothold in the media today? My theory, I guess, is it requires less morality, and it's probably a little easier.
Well, you know, people have often asked me if left-wingers are actually more talented than right-wingers, and maybe they're, you know, bringing more talent. The fact is, by the way, most of the really great writers who are alive today are right-wing. Tom Stoppard, who is, I think, my favorite living writer. Cormac McCarthy, he would never admit it, but he's clearly a right-winger. There's a lot of really good right-wing authors and artists around. But one of the things that happened, for instance, Hollywood was built by a certain generation, mostly Jewish immigrants. And they loved this country because they knew what was out there, right? They had seen what was out there, and they were thrilled to be here. And all they wanted, their liberalism consisted of include us, let us be part of it. So they were happy to make movies about good priests and Christian movies, happy to make movies that appealed, and they were businessmen. They wanted to, make money. for a long, boring story, after a long, boring story, that system, that studio system, was destroyed, partly by the government. And at the same time, the 60s came in, and the artists were all radicalized. And that's pretty much what turned things around. I mean, the artists came in, and they were all radicals, all drug users, all experimenting with the new sexual freedom and all this stuff, and making those pictures. You go back and watch those pictures, most of them stink. But there are a couple of them that are absolutely, The Godfather and Jaws and things like that, they're absolutely spectacular. And once that they were entrenched, they just keep people out. I mean, the blacklist that they complain about, this blacklist against communists in the 50s, is nothing compared to what they do to Christians and conservatives today. So I think that's where it happened. I actually believe that there are plenty of talented conservatives, but it's like in baseball, when they finally said that black people could be managers in baseball. They opened the door and nobody's there. Why? Because the door had been closed with a big sign saying stay out, so people went and did other things, right? It took a while for black people to come in, and now some of the great managers, right? If Hollywood opened its doors, if somebody built a studio that was welcoming to conservatives, it might take a while, but we would take the culture back quickly, I think, because we tell better stories, we have better stories to tell.
Supreme Overlord Klavan, King of the Multiverse, thanks for coming. I'm a big fan of your satire surrounding one Jim Acosta, and I'm wondering if you could state your full opinions on him and anchors like him, and what they could do to change your mind about them.
Quit? Go into another business? You know, this is the Dan Rather syndrome. You know, what happened during the Nixon era. Nixon, another one, they hated Nixon. Nixon was kind of a dark character, but the stuff he did was nowhere near as bad as stuff Obama did. And Dan Rather used to basically shout at him and say things that at that time, Dan Rather and Sam Donaldson used to shout at him and say things that at that time were shocking for a reporter to say to a president. Jim Acosta is imitating that, but to be honest, I mean, Dan Rather is not the smartest guy I ever saw. He's not the best reporter. He made an utter fool of himself during the Bush administration, but he was a journalist. He did have practice. He had been in various places. Acosta has no talent. He has no talent, and really everything he does is an imitation of Dan Rather, who himself, that was the worst thing Rather did, was the shouting. The best thing he did was the journalism. So I just think it's foolish. It makes the entire place look bad. And the only thing that's funny about it is it's actually not working. I mean, CNN now has ratings. Really, seriously, CNN's ratings consist of people running to catch planes. You know, if they took CNN out of airports, it would vanish. If people cut their cable so that you weren't getting CNN, I mean, I get CNN because I want the movie channels, right? And if people did, CNN would vanish. So they've really marginalized themselves, and it's kind of comical and fun to watch. And Acosta is just a clown. He's a clown.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for coming tonight. I believe I have the answer to your question, why Hollywood thinks you're stupid.
All right, let's hear it.
It is because I am wearing camouflage. More specifically, I believe that they think that I am stupid. People who look like me, people who hunt, who fish, people who use firearms, people who are different from them culturally, people who are Christians like me, people who they automatically assume are stupid. Yeah. Several people in my family are farmers in different states, in Oklahoma and in Iowa. And throughout my life, several times, I have had people comment on the fact that members of my family are professional farmers, and comment in a very derisive sense. And that I find really amazing. And I think that that is the answer to your question.
They really don't. You know, I live now in the Hollywood Hills. My next door neighbor, when I moved in, was one of the most famous women in Hollywood. I'm not going to tell you who it was, but really as top as you could be. My house was down here. She trades houses, so she was only there for a year, but she was there for the first year I was there. My house was here, her house was there. I stand out on the patio with a phone, I would scream about Obama, how angry I was at Obama, and I just could feel her up there, you know, like watching. She is one of the biggest anti-gun campaigners in the country. All day long, men with guns walked in and out of that house to protect her. They called me and said, "Don't be afraid, we're watching your house." And I thought, I'm glad you're watching my house, but I got my own gun. It never occurs to this woman one time that those of us who can't afford these bodyguards with guns need guns, you know? It just doesn't occur to her. And it's almost a kind of, they're like a kind of royalty. They're so elevated above our lives that they really don't understand. You know, you say they think you're stupid. I'm not sure they know you're alive, you know? And I just think that's how detached they are.
Hi. So I agree with you that as conservatives we do a poor job of fighting back against the leftward drift of the culture, and that the left has this almost a monopoly on the culture. But I was wondering if you had any ideas on how we could fight back without basically tearing the culture into two parts, where the right consumes one set of media and the left consumes another set of media, and there's not much in common to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think so. That's a really, really good question. I mean, I was watching yesterday when Barbara Bush died, and Obama put out a good statement, and Trump put out a good statement. I thought, could we just enjoy this for like 5 minutes? You know, nah, never mind. Let's go back to hating each other. You know, I really think the secret here is humor. Every age has its art form. You know, every age has its art form. The Elizabethans had the plays, the Victorians had the novels, the 30s and 40s had the movies. I think right now, humor is the thing, satire is the thing, because it's easy to make fun of stupid ideas, right? Right now, every single comedian on TV is a left-winger, an anti-Trumper, every single one of those late-night comedians. The other day in the New York Times, a guy wrote an entire article about a joke on the Roseanne show. He said it was like being punched in the gut because it was an anti-PC thing. And I thought, are you kidding me? One joke, every single comedian on TV. But the thing is, we don't need TV, you know? My pal Steve Crowder, who's a comedian, his ratings are bigger than theirs on his podcast. They're trying to silence us on YouTube, but we still have YouTube. We still have the internet. We still have all these places. And Twitter, people on Twitter are some of the funniest people I've ever seen. We can dissect them with humor, and everybody likes to laugh. And so even though there's some people who are never going to laugh at themselves, that whole range of people in the middle are willing to hear when something is absurd. And I think that's the secret, and I think that's the kind of, I think the two great forms that are coming down the pike are a certain kind of science fiction and humor, and I think we should use humor to kill them. Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Klavan. Thank you for coming and welcome to Texas.
Thank you.
My name is Hagen. I'm a senior who's graduating this year in May. And I was thinking about how Hollywood kind of took over the culture, like what caused that and what we can do to fight back against it. And I think a big problem is lots of millennials, instead of going out and getting productive jobs once they graduate, they're basically sitting home and eating Tide Pods all day. So my question is Daily Wire hiring?
I sometimes go on Knowles' show as a millennial, you know, and I went on, it took a Tide Pod out of my mouth in the middle of a conversation. Yes, they are. The Daily Wire is amazing. The Daily Wire we started in the guy who runs the place, Jeremy Boring, had a pool. He had a pool house where people would go in and change. We started doing podcasts in his pool house. That was less than 3 years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago. It is now virtually a TV station, and it is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and yes, they're hiring.
I'll give you my business card. Thank you, sir.
Jesus, sorry. So I remember you were talking about how, like, Hollywood basically shapes minds, right? Like, kind of like alluding to Ben Shapiro's propaganda book or whatever. So, you know, more often than not, I go into a classroom full of people who lean to the left or just have more liberal values than conservative. Should I be afraid to engage in conversation out of course, consideration for their hurt feelings, or should I take every chance that I see and just pounce it and prove my teacher wrong with my... God, I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so nervous. Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's it.
You want to know, should you take the chance? Should you take the chance? You're probably asking the wrong person, because I've never been able to shut up in my life. But I will tell you this. I had a fairly big Hollywood career when I started protesting about what they were doing. I was selling sometimes 2 and 3 scripts a year, which is big money. It's a really good career. And it dried up. I never lost a night's sleep, not one night's sleep. I never cared. I mean, I missed the money. It was great money, you know. But there's something about speaking your mind civilly. I'm like one of the most polite people. Even Ann Coulter admitted this about me. She said, "You are really polite. You are really polite." But politely, to say what you have to say, kindly, civilly, to say what you have to say, is one of the most ennobling kinds of lives that you can live, you know? Will it cost you? It'll cost you, you know? And do you choose your fights? Yes. Do I open my mouth every single time I hear some stupid thing? No, of course not. But I don't ever want to smile and pretend that I agree, because once you do that, they own you, you know? And so I'm terribly afraid I'm going to open my door one day and your parents are going to be outside and they're going to kick me down a flight of stairs because you got thrown out of school. But you know, there's a statue in a chapel in Yale that has written in Latin the words, "Do right, fear nothing." I use this as a motto in a book, and I think it's a great motto. You know, and I think to speak your mind honestly, fairly, decently, civilly, politely is just an ennobling experience. And like I said, it will cost you, and if you're like me, you'll never lose a night's sleep.
Thank you for coming out, Mr. Klavan. You'd mentioned like a second ago about how like humor and satire would be our art form that we could work with, and as we all know, the left can't meme. So I mean, that's our strong point. We should definitely work on that. But I guess the greater issue at this point is a matter of censorship and how people kind of shut down these voices. So since you're sort of in that field, how do you see things progressing from here on out with kind of voices being shut up and like channels being demonetized and so on and so forth? Since that's our biggest like avenue right now, since Hollywood's already gone and so on and so forth.
It's an amazing problem. It was completely planned. You know, it was actually, this whole thing about fake news came from the left, not from Donald Trump. And it was a way of getting Facebook and YouTube and Twitter to accept basically left-wing censors into their midst. And they have been working on it. Media Research Center just did a study showing how badly they have been censoring us. You know, we have to keep fighting back. We have to fight every way we can. But we also have to build our own stuff, you know? I mean, this is the thing I cannot understand about the right. This is what I was going around making speeches about. Why don't we build our own platforms? And you know, our platforms shouldn't be conservative platforms. Our platforms should be open platforms, because that's what conservatism is. You know, it's opening, it's belief in free speech, it's belief in argument, it's belief in debate, it's belief in not shutting people down. So we should just demonstrate, if we could just show them how it's done, how America is done, I think we could wipe them out. You know, I mean, you look at Fox News. Look at Fox News, how successful they are. Why isn't there a Fox comedy channel? Why isn't there a Fox, you know, drama channel? Why don't we do those things that are so successful? And I don't really know the answer, but I think we have to start.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Klavan. Thank you for coming. So, I believe in the statement that if you want to end racism, then stop talking about race.
Yeah.
So the question is, why does the left in Hollywood focus so much on race? If it's not to end racism, then what do they hope to achieve?
Oh well, I think power. You know, I mean, I think it's a philosophy of dividing us and basically telling each group of us that they're going to help us as a group. So they put you in a grievance group and then they serve your grievance. Our philosophy is, I agree with you. The way you stop having injustice is to start being just, right? And the way you are just is you treat everybody fairly. Everybody who walks up to you is the same person, you know, the same, just show me what you can do. Just show me who you are, and that's how I'm going to treat you. And that is the way forward, and it's the only way forward, because we can't make the past disappear. So I really do believe that their philosophy is a power play. You know, why do you do it? Because there is a history of racism in this country. People felt very guilty about it, and the left manipulates it and uses it. I think Barack Obama was a past master at this. I think his presidency was a failure, and I think he used race to basically shut people up about it. And I think that to me, it's a slimy thing to do, you know? I mean, I just think this is the beautiful thing about this country. It really is. I mean, walk into any airport, look around, you know? The world doesn't look like this. Only America still looks like this, you know? And we pulled it off. And they're trying to move us back. Everything, they call it progressive, but everything they do is regressive, you know? It's tribal. It is separating people, you know? We had this great new idea, which is e pluribus unum, out of the many we'll make one. Their idea is, let's take that apart again. Like nobody's ever tried that before. But it works. It works. It gets them the power they need.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Klavan. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thank you.
So I am a high school senior, and on Friday there's going to be a walkout that is an anti-gun walkout, and it is mandated by the school that I walk out to do it.
Wow,
yeah,
really?
I have to do it, despite my political beliefs. So I'm going to say, given that this is true, how can the left claim the moral high ground in the liberal arts and history departments and claim moral subjectivism and postmodernism, and that all views are equal if they hold these kinds of standards?
Well, their point of view about all views and cultures being equal makes absolutely no sense, because what they're actually saying is there's no right or wrong, and therefore if you judge somebody else, you're wrong. And you say, well, if there's no right or wrong, how can I be wrong to judge somebody else? That's my thing. I like to judge people, you know. so it makes no sense, which is why they have to mandate, why they have to silence, because the minute you start arguing back, everything falls apart. I hope you will go to some news agency and tell them that this is being done, because I think that that's a good story, you know, and I think that people should know that shouldn't happen to anybody. No. Sure.
Hi, you mentioned the need for conservatives to get out and create alternative storytelling venues and get into the arts and the culture more. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or knowledge about why Glenn Beck's attempt to do just that collapsed as spectacularly as it seems to have.
Well, you know, I love Glenn. Glenn is a great guy. Glenn is one of these people who everybody who works for him has been working for him for like 30 years, you know, and when you see that, that's not true of all these big stars, right? I think that there's a lot of things that happened, and some of them I'm not going to talk about because they're none of my business, but one of the things I think that happened was he made a bet on a subscription model, and the subscription model just didn't quite take off. He has a huge subscription base, but what he didn't count on, I think, is that it took him out of the general conversation. And this is one of the problems we have in breaking through, that still a Stephen Colbert going on TV in the middle of the night is more powerful than a YouTube video that gets even 10 million hits, right? These alternative venues haven't quite garnered the cultural power that they have, and he took a really brave step. He did a really brave thing, and I think it didn't work because that subscription model doesn't quite have the cultural heft, you know, that it has. But I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back. He's an enormously talented guy, and you know, he took a big stand against Trump, and that probably hurt him with his audience too. But he is just an enormously talented guy, and he's a real, you know, he's like Ben. He's a real broadcast talent. You know, I mean, he's one of those guys, the minute you hear him with a microphone, you think, oh, that's what you're born to do, you know, and like, so I wouldn't count him out yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Klavan. All right, one more round of applause for Mr. Andrew Klavan. So before we wrap up, Lily is going to take a group picture for us. So she'll stand on the stage. Everyone can stay in their seats, and we'll just do a quick picture all together.
You're the star of the show, so.
We're going to stand up in your
Yeah,
seats.
everyone.
In your seats.
Or you can stand yeah. We'll take it this way, so. I'm short, but I'm wearing heels, so it's all good.
Can you get everyone?
Yeah. I'll take a couple. Ooh, I could take a panoramic picture.
Want to do one with our cult symbol, please?
Oh, yes.
This is our school
So you
cult
two
symbol.
sign.
Just like call me. Hope this doesn't mean something like I'm not.
No, this is hook 'em horns.
So at this time, we would like to invite YCT members to stay for a meet and greet with Mr. Klavan. If you're not a YCT member and you're interested in joining, come talk to me or Sarab or Lily or any of the members afterwards. We would love to talk to you about it. Thank you so much. Thanks for letting me use your book. What? You earned it. For sure.